So there's been a lot of talk recently about AI and, AI among YouTube content creators. And I saw something that Brett Coleman posted on Twitter talking about how he found it pretty disingenuous or something along those lines with how content creators will use AI, be it in the thumbnail or even in the content itself, using AI voices or some sort of AI generated video. And he was kind of talking about how he thinks that viewers would lose respect for content creators that would use it. And I would agree, and most notably because AI is not at a point in which viewers would be able to look at it and confuse it with what is reality, like something that actually happened. It's still not there yet, even if you want to argue that it's close. Why am I saying all this? Well, it is because even though I agree with Brett Coleman, this video took me so goddamn long that I almost wish I just went to AI in the first place. Jesus Christ, what was I thinking? Like, the offseason is bad and it's a dry desert for content in terms of football, but I don't know why I turned to this. Although, I can't deny it has certainly kept me busy. So, if you're very confused about what's going on, allow me to explain. I came up with this idea towards the end of the season as we were facing quarterbacks that presently have not yet beaten the Buccaneers, even though they have been given multiple opportunities, and it got me thinking, who in their NFL career have the Buccaneers faced and that player on the other team, the quarterback for the other team, has not beaten the Buccaneers? So I decided to look into it, which of course meant I had to go through every single Buccaneers game and see who hasn't ever beaten the Buccaneers. And believe me when I say it took a lot of work. If you want a more in-depth analysis of how I accomplished this, so you can sort of check my work if you really want to, go to the first video and watch the first couple of minutes. I said before that I would break this down by decades because the list ended up being so long that I couldn't possibly put it into one video. So I'm just going to create this huge playlist. So last time I did this, it was the 80s, so obviously I've moved to the 90s. Dear Lord, there are so many quarterbacks here. It is ridiculous. And it's not just that there's so many quarterbacks here. So many of them have an extensive background that, of course, I had to talk about because obviously, needless to say, this will take me a very long time, so strap in because we're going to be here for a while. The first victim on this list, quarterback, is one Brad Gable on the Eagles. Now, Brad faced the Buccaneers in 1991. Despite setting several of Baylor's passing records and being put into the Hall of Fame in 2021, he did not end up being drafted by anyone and would instead go undrafted to the Eagles out of college. Now, he's only appeared in 6 NFL games. He started 2 for the Eagles and 1 with the Browns. In his entire career, he didn't manage to throw a single passing touchdown. He doesn't even have a rushing touchdown, which of course meant that he wouldn't throw one against the Bucs. Now, it was a true offensive showcase between Gable and Chris Candler. Gable threw 20 times and completed 9 of those passes for 62 yards and, of course, 2 interceptions. Candler didn't do that much better. He had 105 yards for completing 7 of 11 passes, and he had 2 picks, but he also had 2 touchdowns. And who could forget the fact that Vinny Testaverde was also in this game to go 5 for 18, and of course there was an interception. Now, like I said, Gable had only appeared in 6 games, starting 3, so there's really not much of an NFL playing career to talk about, and after he would end up leaving the NFL, he would end up working for Horseshoe Bay Resort Realty, and according to Baylor's own website, I think it was from the Hall of Fame entry, he would involve himself in various charities in and around Texas. Like I said, there's not much going on with Gable. He was just one of those guys that ended up being not even a career backup, just a backup for a couple of seasons and kind of left the NFL with little fanfare. The same can also be said of the next guy on this list, Tim Rosenbach, who played the Buccaneers twice in the same season in 1992. What division rival did he play for? Oh, he didn't actually play for any division rival. He played for the Arizona Cardinals. The Phoenix Cardinals as they were at the time. Now, Why did the Phoenix Cardinals play the Buccaneers twice in 1992? I have no idea whatsoever. I looked through the Bucs website, there's an article about this game, and it explains that they did in fact play each other twice, but it's not made especially clear why these two teams would face each other twice, considering they were never in the same division. But whatever. Tim Mosenbach came out of Washington State, which will actually be a trend with some of the guys on this list. He would be drafted with the second overall pick in the 1989 supplemental draft by the the Phoenix Cardinals. Now, he would start every game in 1990, and it wouldn't be a terrible season. He threw for almost 3,100 yards, but it was a 16 touchdown to 17 interception ratio. But in 1992, he would only end up playing 8 games, with again 2 of those coming against the Buccaneers. In their first game this season, he would go 12 for 22 for 77 yards and a pick. And for some reason, he would be platooning with, former Bucs QB Chris Candler. I have to be honest, I don't know when that happened. And also Tony Saka. I don't know who that is. His last start of this season would, of course, be against the Buccaneers, where he would attempt 1 pass, which was intercepted. Now, this time the other 2 QBs were Chris Candler and Ricky Proehl, who I don't think is a quarterback. Candler would end up starting most of the game, but technically speaking, Rosenbach was in fact in this game, so technically he lost this game as well. And the one thing all 3 of these QBs had in common is that they would throw at least 1 pick. Or in Candler's case, 3. Now, Rosenbach, like Rusty Hilger in the last video, would ultimately be derailed by injuries. His injuries either forced him to retire or the Cardinals just ended up cutting him. Either way, he was off of the cards, and while he attempted several comebacks, which included a stint in the CFL and trying to join with the Saints, injuries would ultimately be the death of his playing career. Now, it would not be the end of him and his involvement in football, as he would become the OC for several colleges. He called plays for his alma mater from 2003 to 2007, then was OC of Montana in 2012, only to then be OC of Weber later in 2012. I don't know what happened there. Was that like a Josh McDaniels sort of thing, or did he just get fired early in the season from Montana only to then join Weber that same year? I don't really know what happened there. 2 months later, he would be OC at UNLV, so at least it was a different year, I guess. He would become the head coach of Adams State, where he went 9 for 23 before resigning and returning to Montana in 2017. But he is now currently the co-offensive coordinator at Cal Poly. What a coaching career. I really don't know how this is so chaotic, and I'm really curious what happened there. But speaking of guys with an interesting history, we have Heath Shuler, who played on the Redskins in 1994, where he faced the Buccaneers twice. But both of those games would again be in 1994. That's right, we have a non-division team playing the Buccaneers twice, and it's not because of the playoffs. This time, though, there seems to be an explanation for it, as there used to be a scheduling quirk when the NFL used to have 5-team divisions, as the last place teams of each of those divisions would play the other last place teams twice. So that's how the Buccaneers seemed to end up playing the Redskins twice, as both teams weren't exactly good during those periods. Now, Shuler played for the Tennessee Vols in college and cemented himself as one of their best QBs by setting several quarterback records, although they would all be broken by some guy named Peyton Manning a few years down the road. Because of his play, though, the Redskins would use the 3rd overall pick on him in 1994. But like Jack Thompson before him, he just wouldn't work out on Washington and would ultimately be a bust, as he just didn't play well. It's as simple as that. In his 3rd year, he would be benched for 7th rounder Gus Frerotte. Now, keep that name in mind as he will come up later in this video, just to give you a brief spoiler, I guess. Nola would trade for Shula, but a foot injury would sideline him and he would sign with the Raiders instead before having to retire because of another foot injury. He would end his career with an over 1-to-2 touchdown to interception ratio, apparently I forgot how to talk, of 15-33. Although his games against the Buccaneers would be an outlier in a good way in terms of his overall career statistics. In Week 14, Shula threw 25 times, completing 13 passes for 278 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 pick. 2 weeks later, he would go 17 of 35 for 201 yards and 2 touchdowns. Both these games would end up being really close, as the first one was 26-21 and the last one being 17-14. However, Shula's story doesn't end here. Arguably, it just gets started. Shula would show an interest in state politics and would run for the House of Representatives in the 11th District of North Carolina in 2006, which, if you aren't aware, encompassed pretty much all of Asheville at the time, and, in a side note, is where I went to college. It does make sense once you learn that he was born in nearby Bryson City, and he did play for the team in DC, so he might have grew interested in politics just by being in close proximity to them. Who really knows? But the point is, he would run against 8-term incumbent Charles Taylor, who at the time was a Republican. He would run as the Democratic nominee. Now, the district was fairly conservative despite including Asheville, which I think at the time was still a liberal bastion, which is what it is now. But the district was conservative, so was Shula. He opposed abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and gun control. Basically, it seems like he was one of those Democrats who were economically Democrat, but were socially conservative, if that makes sense. But if he wanted to win, he did have to be a conservative Democrat, as really that would be the only thing that would guarantee him, or that would give him a chance at getting the upset, which is of course what happened. Shula's election victory would be one of the biggest political upsets at the time, and true to his word, he would vote like a conservative Democrat. Ultimately, he would end up leading the Blue Dog Coalition, which were state representatives like him who were conservative Dems in right-leaning districts. He voted against the Emergency Stabilization Act of 2008 both times, and also against the ACA, although he would vote yes on an amendment to the bill saying federal funds wouldn't be used on abortions. It's nice to know that he truly stood for what he believed in. He would also vote against the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, a bill that expanded the definition of hate crimes to include religion, skin color, and perceived sexual identity. In 2011, he would co-sponsor a bill titled No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act. I wonder what that could be for. It seems pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, he really didn't want federal funds to be used on abortions. Now, he would attempt to run against then Minority Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but obviously lost because, well, he ran against Nancy Pelosi. And because of that sin, he would end up being shivved in an alley as Republicans redrew his district in 2012. So he would end up deciding not to run, most likely because Republicans in the state are corrupt as hell and they gerrymandered the district to hell and back, which would lead to Mike Meadows winning. Yes, that Mike Meadows. He would complete his turn to the dark side by becoming a lobbyist for Duke Energy, which, if you know anything about them and live in North Carolina, you know that guarantees you a spot in hell. One guy that hopefully isn't going to hell, yeah, sure, let's go with that transition, I guess, is that guy I mentioned before, Gus Frerotte, who played against the Bucs in 1995. But he also played against them in 96, 99, 2005, and 2008. And what teams did he play when he faced the Bucs? Or what teams was he on when he faced against the Bucs? I'm so glad you asked. He played on the Redskins, Lions, Dolphins, and Vikings. But that's not even the full list of teams. He's played on so many teams. He also has the honor of being the guy on this list with the most losses at 5, and again, the most teams. He played for, outside of those teams I mentioned before, the Broncos, Bengals, and Rams. This is on top of all those teams that I said. The OG Ryan Fitzpatrick, if you will, he played college at Tulsa, where he was a pretty respectable QB and was also the punter for some inexplicable reason. As stated before, he was a 6th-round pick by the Redskins and would end up becoming the starter, taking over for Heath Shuler, who at the time was probably already writing campaign speeches to try and take North Carolina's 11th. He would play the Bucs one time as a skin, where he would go 21 of 40 for 230 yards and 1 interception. Injuries, like many of the guys on this list, would plague him during his playing career, as he ended up giving himself a neck sprain by hitting his head on a padded wall during a touchdown celebration. That is not a joke. I couldn't make that up if I wanted to. He would be cut after the 1998 season, despite being a Pro Bowler in 1996, where he threw for 12 touchdowns. I guess they're just giving him out to everybody, huh? The Lions would ultimately pick him up, and he would end up starting 9 games for an injured Charlie Batch, one of which included the playoffs, but he lost to his former team in the wild card. That season, he threw for over 2,100 yards, completed over 60% of his passes, and threw 9 TDs to 7 picks. He would always have good stats really in all of his seasons, although the touchdowns to interception ratio wouldn't exactly be great. I've never seen him throw more touchdowns to picks in most of his seasons. However, when he did face the Buccaneers that season, he had a less efficient day, as he went 23 for 44 for 241 yards and an interception. He would join Denver once he left the Lions, and outside him winning a game against San Francisco after 5 turnovers, which of course he made up for by throwing 5 touchdowns, nothing much happened there. He would then go on to back up Dante Culpepper in 03 and 04, but would go to the Dolphins in 2005, where he played the Buccaneers yet again. In this game, he went 21 of 43 for 267 yards, no touchdowns, no picks. And finally, he would end up finishing his career in Minnesota, where he would actually tie the record for the longest touchdown pass at 99 yards when he played the Bears. This time around, he actually did have a pretty efficient game, as he went 14 of 20 for 138 yards and 1 touchdown. He wanted the starting job for the Vikings, but they ended up going with washed Jets QB Brett Favre. For a 6th-round pick, he wasn't really that bad, and also for a career backup, he was never a terrible QB, although his games against the Bucs would always be worse, or almost always would be worse than his career stats or his average stats. Farote, after leaving the NFL, would bounce around to various careers and various companies, including coaching and also helping kids pick their college. He would also join a company called RC21X, which apparently measures human performance, I think, in terms of cognitive or like brain performance. He would be the VP of Business Development, although based on the company's own website and their LinkedIn, it doesn't seem like they've done much in 4 years. And now he seems to just go on various shows where he talks about QBs in the NFL and his own personal experience. Coming in next, we have yet another late-round pick with an interesting career in Jeff Blake, who played the Buccaneers once when he was on the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, Blake played QB at Seminole High School and was heavily recruited by local colleges like the OG Seminoles, FSU, but they didn't want him to play quarterback. They wanted him to switch positions. Now, why would a college ask a skilled QB prospect to switch positions? Well, based on what I was able to find, it seems to have been motivated by his race. So he ultimately chose ECU, who weren't racist, and let him play quarterback. Fun fact though, FSU would try this against Jameis Winston. They told him no, he could not play quarterback for them. But like always, Jameis Winston ignored the fact that consent was not given. He would lead ECU, Jeff Blake, not Jameis Winston that is, in 1991 to an 11-1 record and the number 9 overall ranking in the country. But despite all this, he was selected in the 6th round by the Jets in 92. The reason for this was because he was under 6 foot, so it was size discrimination. At least according to most sources, as some did say he was 6'1", but based off of what most was saying, it seems like he was actually under 6 foot entirely. And remember that this was before shorter QBs like Breeze and Russell Wilson proved that they could be successful. He never played for New Jersey, which means that he had a better QB career than most drafted by that cesspool, but his former head coach would be fired and hired by Cincinnati as an OC, where he convinced them to trade for Blake. He started in 1994 after starter and backup David Klinger and Donald Hollis respectively were injured. He went 3 for 6, but he put up respectable numbers as he threw for 2,154 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 9 picks. At least those stats were good enough to get a song named after him called Shakin' Blake, which I know sounds like a Bingo Boys parody, but it was a real song in reference to his play style. And I'm gonna be completely honest here, it's not too bad. It kinda has the flow of a rap song, but I find it kind of difficult to call it that just based off how slow it is, and it just doesn't feel like a rap song. I don't know, you just kinda have to listen to it to understand what I'm saying. The melody though is really catchy, and even though I do have a question about he was better in the jungle than a rattlesnake, like I never thought of rattlers as jungle creatures really, so that's kind of a weird lyric. Needless to say, the song would propel him to a Pro Bowl season where he threw for 3,822 yards, 28 touchdowns, and 17 picks. He would, however, only win 7 games. He was so good that season that most fans on Reddit are arguing that he was the reason a tax hike to pay for the Bengals ultimately passed. He also would lead the Bengals to the only non-losing season between 1991 and 2002, when he, in 1996, led them to an 8-8 record. Once again, he put up respectable numbers with 3,624 yards, 24 TDs, and 14 picks. However, the Bengals defense was ranked 23rd in points allowed, 25th in yards, and bottom in pretty much every defensive ranking that was bad, which might be why they didn't win more. You know, defense laying down exceptional QB play. Where have Bengals fans seen that one before? Jeff Blake, though, might actually have one of the greatest arms I've ever seen in terms of throwing moon balls. It puts Russell Wilson, hell, I think he throws a better ball than prime Aaron Rodgers. Like, it's really good. However, like most of these guys, he would not be as good when he faced the Bucs in 1995. He threw 1 touchdown to 3 picks and barely had over a 50% completion percentage. Now, the Bengals would ultimately try to replace him with Achilles Smith, which did not work for obvious reasons, and he, funny enough, went to NOLA in 1989. He was looking respectable yet again, but a foot injury. What is with the guys on this list and foot injuries? Seriously. The foot injury would sideline him in NOLA, where he would be replaced by Aaron Brooks in 2000, and they just never looked back. He would bounce around the league for a little bit before retiring in 2006. He would not be the best QB in Bengals history, but he still had respectable numbers, and he had a 14-year career, which is mightily impressive. Oh, and he also has a rap song, so how many QBs can say that? Steve Berline, unfortunately, would not get a rap song, although he did play the Bucs when he was on the Jaguars and also the Panthers in 1995 and 1998. Now, Berline unfortunately went to the college Cowboys / Toronto Maple Leafs, aka Notre Dame. he would break multiple passing records for the Fighting Irish despite only having a 21-18 record and having a pretty up and down career because of, you guessed it, injury. The Raiders would draft him in the 4th round in 1987, and he would start his first game in 1988 against the San Diego Chargers with a 24-13 victory. Mike Shanahan, who I didn't even know coached the Raiders, if I'm being completely honest, would eventually bench him for Jay Schroeder on and off again throughout that season and next year. But there was a storm brewing. The autumn wind was a fickle mistress. He would win the starting job at the end of 1989, but he was only being paid $140K, which was the lowest amount for a starting QB at the time. Naturally, like most players would do, he would hold out for a better contract, which, as I said, is a standard move. It doesn't really warrant any kind of retaliatory measures, I would argue. And despite me not finding any evidence that he did anything below the belt or anything worse than hold out, Al Davis would end up blowing up like Hades and Hercules and basically pushed him out. He demoted him all the way to scout QB for the rest of the year, and not only that, but he would refuse to initially trade Beuerlein to the Cowboys at the beginning of training camp, only to do it later, so it cost him a $250K signing bonus. But Jimmy Johnson really wanted Steve Beuerlein, and that desire would ultimately end up proving to be a right instinct as he came in for an injured Troy Aikman in Week 13 and won all of his starts. This would be in the 1991 season, and even though Troy Aikman came back in time for the wild card, he would end up starting Beuerlein, who won against the Bears, but starting Beuerlein again in Detroit would end up being the wrong move as they were run over by Detroit in the next round, which for current day Cowboys is par for the course. Because of those starts, he would be a sought-after free agent and ultimately ended up with the Phoenix Cardinals. Although, were they the Arizona Cardinals at this point? I don't know. But his first season would be pretty good despite a 7-9 record, as he was a top 10 passer by most quarterback metrics. But then the Cardinals hired Buddy Ryan. After Beuerlein made the inexcusable, unforgivable error of going 0-2 at the start of the season, Buddy Ryan called him one of the worst QBs he had ever seen. Strange as it may seem, this comment did not go over well with Steve Beuerlein, although according to Peter DeBoer, it's a perfectly winning strategy that worked out great for him when he blamed Otter for the playoff loss. However, unlike Peter DeBoer, Beuerlein would be the one that got fired, as he was picked up by the expansion Jaguars in 1995, which is the first team where he would lose against the Buccaneers, in case you forgot at this point. He was the starter for the Jags, but he ended up getting an MCL sprain, which led to Mike Brunell starting, and it was a Mike Brunell injury where Beuerlein would reappear in Week 11 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, normally I don't delve too deeply into the full, breakdown of the games, but I want to break this one down because it's one of the more exciting matches between a Bucs team and one of these quarterbacks. The Jags were down by 10 heading into the third, only to tie the game up with 13 points in the fourth, and Beuerlein leading a 96-yard touchdown to potentially tie the game. However, Tom Coughlin put his nuts on the table and decided to go for the throat and went for 2 to try and win, which of course he did not. Oh, and speaking of Tom Coughlin, he also had a rocky relationship with him, so the Jags ultimately would not re-sign him after the season where his contract expired. Wait, does that mean the Jags used their first round pick in the expansion draft on a guy whose deal ended up expiring the year after? That's a little bit strange. This would, however, work out really well for Steve Beuerlein as he would enter into the most prolific and successful part of his career as he joined the Carolina Panthers in 1996. Now, he didn't have a ton of success initially as he just wasn't the starter, but in 1999, he would win the starting battle, and he ended up leading the league in passing yards with 4,436. He had the most completions and the second most touchdown passes behind Kurt Warner, who actually ended up winning MVP, not Steve Berline. Thankfully for the Bucs, they wouldn't play Steve Berline in his 1999 MVP season, as they weren't division rivals at the time. The Bucs were still in the NFC Central, so they played him the season before, and he would lose yet another close game to the Bucs as Tampa came back from a deficit to win by scoring 13 in the fourth quarter. Berline didn't do too much in this game. He did complete 22 of 31 passes for 234 yards, but he didn't throw a touchdown. But he also didn't cost the Panthers, as he didn't throw a pick or turn the ball over either. Berline, because of his 1999 season, would end up claiming most of the Panthers' single-season passing records, with Cam Newton being one of the few QBs after him to claim some of them for himself. Berline would ultimately reunite with his former coach Mike Shanahan in Denver, backing up Brian Griese, and he would occasionally start for an injured starter, but he retired after 39 despite the Broncos wanting him back, and signed a one-day contract with Carolina to retire with the Panthers. He is now a game analyst for CBS and also a Cowboys radio host, a job in which I assume their only mission is to yell about how the Cowboys are going to the Super Bowl every single year. Steve Berline, though, would be joined by another QB in 1996 as members on this list, as Jeff Brum faced the Bucs in that same season when he was on the 49ers. Now, Brum, I swear to God, has to be one of the most injured, snake-bitten QBs I have ever seen. I almost expected to read on how an anvil was dropped on his head while he was in the huddle taking a knee. He backed up Brownie Nagel in Louisville as a freshman, but would become the starter next season. However, 2 games in, he had a fractured ankle. After that, though, he would end up leading the Cardinals to the number 17 ranking, but of course would break his index finger in their final regular season game. Despite being drafted by the Montreal Expos in 1989, he ended up going into the NFL as a UDFA, where he got picked up by the Chargers. In 96, he went to San Fran, where of course another finger would break. I don't know what his bones are made of. He would play Week 1 against the Bucs after Steve Young got a concussion. For the record, if you're confused, that was 49ers Steve Young, not Buccaneers Steve Young, so Jeff Brum would start for Steve Young after he got a concussion playing for the 49ers, in case you were wondering, or were confused about that. Brum went 10 of 13, but only threw for 99 yards, which is honestly impressively low for completing 10 passes. Funny enough, though, if that Steve Young kerfuffle wasn't confusing enough, Brum would end up joining the Buccaneers in 1998, much like Jack Thompson, who was in the other video. However, on a QB slide, he would tear a ligament in his thumb during the Hall of Fame game, and the subsequent surgery ended his season. Seriously, what were this guy's bones and muscles made out of? Nothing much happened during his playing career except for one thing. After the NFL, he would join the Orlando Rage in the XFL, but he would end up being hospitalized on an attempted tackle. I guess maybe it was on either an interception or maybe it was a fumble by another player or by him even. But he was somehow on the sideline for the game with a neck brace and played the next week. When he was asked about that, he had this to say. Let me answer that question by asking you 2 questions. 1, is this or is this not the XFL? Yes, it is. 2, do I or do I not currently have a pulse? Yes, I do. Let's play football. Now that's a football badass. This quote, however, wouldn't lead to him staying with the Rage for more than a season, and thus would begin his saga of coaching. He started out as head coach for the AFL team Louisville Fire, going 2 of 14 before joining Bobby Petrino in Louisville. He would end up recruiting his brother, by the way, to the Cardinals. He would bounce around as a position coach for multiple teams like FAU, Illinois, University of Alabama, Birmingham, Western Kentucky, and so on and so forth. Brum would eventually be the head honcho at Purdue, where he took the program out of a dark age, even though he didn't have a super impressive record as he was only 36 for 34. He eventually returned home as HC of the Louisville Cardinals, where he is now. I don't really have a transition for this one, so we'll just go to Kelly Holcomb, who played the Bucs when he was on the Colts and Bills in 1997 and 2005. Holcomb played at Middle Tennessee when he was in college, not exactly a hotbed for NFL talent, and he would join the Barcelona Dragons, who played in the World League of American Football in 1996. Obviously, that league went under, and he would join the Bucs practice squad before eventually the Colts picked him up. 1997 will be the only season where he played games for the Colts, and he threw for 1 touchdown to 8 interceptions. Not exactly MVP level talent. When he played the Bucs, he did manage to get more air yards than Trent Dilfer, but still only went 19 of 30 for 181 yards and an interception. But despite this lackluster quarterback performance and also the fact that the Colts hadn't won a game at this point in the season, they still hung around and only barely lost to the Bucs 31-28. Eventually, the Browns would pick him up because, they always have quarterback trouble. And he would be sitting behind the number 1 pick, Tim Couch, and also coached by OC Bruce Arians. I don't know what Bruce Arians did to deserve this punishment, but whatever. Maybe he did something in a past life that was really bad. In 2002, he would eventually replace Tim Couch and become the starter for the Browns, where he started 8 games and led the Browns to their first playoff appearance since they rejoined the NFL. It would be against the Steelers, where they of course lost. It would surprisingly not be because of Holcomb though, as he threw for 429 yards and nearly led a comeback against the Steel City. Holcomb would be replaced by Jeff Garcia, however, in the next season, because obviously the Browns don't want to keep good quarterbacks trapped on their roster, as Baker Mayfield can attest to. After the Browns replaced him, he would join the Bills, where he played the Bucs one more time. Well, sorta. He did go 2 for 3 for -1 yards, as J.P. Lossman took the majority of the snaps in that game. The Bills eventually traded him to the Eagles, but he never played there, and the Eagles would trade him to the Vikings, where he retired in 2008. Next up, we have a Patriots QB coming up on this list, and this certainly won't be the last one, with Tom Brady, of course, coming up very soon. But we're not there yet. We are, of course, talking about Scott Zolak. Now, I don't normally do this, but I want to focus briefly on Zolak's high school career. Well, specifically the fact that he would end up going to the same high school, Ringgold, as Joe Montana. He met Montana when he was a water boy for the high school, and Montana gave him a football, which Zolak started rubbing for good luck when he started playing football for Ringgold. Now, after high school, Zolak would go to the University of Maryland after graduating, where he backed up Neil O'Donnell, the guy most famous for phoning it in against the Cowboys in the Super Bowl. But somehow he's undefeated against the Bucs. I don't know. Whatever. He struggled mightily in his senior year, as the first 4 games of the year he was sacked 23 times and had 12 interceptions. Despite this, the Patriots would still draft him in the 4th round of the 1991 draft. His first appearance in a game would come in his second season, where he came in for Tommy Hodson in the 4th against the Saints in a blowout loss. Zolak would get the Patriots their first and second win of the season against the Colts and Jets respectively. Somehow the Patriots sucking doesn't seem so foreign anymore. Despite these wins, new HC Bill Parcells would turn to newly drafted quarterback Drew Bledsoe, and after Drew Bledsoe entered the picture, he would never play much, although he would occasionally step in when Bledsoe would get injured. He did come in for injury for Bledsoe against the Bucs, who were at the time beating the Patriots handily. He would end up having a better game, at least statistically speaking, than Bledsoe, as he went 3 for 6 for 34 yards and scored a touchdown, which were the only points the Pats scored in that game. He would eventually be signed by the Jets, again another team that doesn't have any quarterback issues in their history, where he backed up Vinny Testaverde, but they would cut him because I guess he wasn't even good enough for the team starting Vinny Testaverde, and the Dolphins would snap him up until they eventually cut him 2 seasons later. Most people probably know him now as a commentator on radio shows for the Patriots, like his show Zolak and Bertrand on 98.5. Not the most interesting career like so many other guys on this list. He was just an unremarkable backup. However, the next guy is very much the opposite, as we are now looking at Drew Bledsoe, who faced the Bucs twice in his career and lost both times. I don't think there's any quarterback on this list that quite intersects so perfectly, other than maybe Gus Frerotte a few QBs back. Bledsoe obviously is most well known for being upstaged by Tom Brady, but he was still a good quarterback in his own right. Bledsoe went to Washington State. Remember when I said that would be a pattern among these guys, despite being recruited by Miami, as he went the Jake Locker route and chose Washington State out of loyalty as he lived near WSU. He was a Pac-10 Player of the Year when the Pac-10 still existed, and because of that, he would end up declaring after his junior year. The Patriots ended up selecting Bledsoe first overall in 1993. First 2 seasons, nothing spectacular, but they were certainly good. And in 1994, he would set the NFL record for most pass attempts in a single game against the Vikings with 70 pass attempts in a victory from behind. In 1996, he would break the Patriots' playoff drought and lead them all the way to Super Bowl 31, where he lost against the Green Bay Packers. He would lead the Pats to the playoffs again the next year, but the Steelers, because they didn't have Tom Brady, actually managed to beat the Patriots when it mattered most. And remember that game in 1997 with Scott Zolak? Well, here's Bledsoe's side of it, so you can see what I'm talking about when I said he had a worse game than the previously mentioned Pats quarterback. He went 13 of 25 for 117 yards and 2 picks. So yes, I think Scott Zolak did have a better game than Bledsoe. He would once again go back to being good, not great, and even though he did slide statistically in 1999 and 2000, the Patriots still signed him to a record-breaking, at the time, 10-year, $103 million contract, which I believe is the going rate for long snappers now in the NFL. The 2000 game against the Buccaneers would be slightly more respectable than the 1997 game, as Bledsoe ended up completing 26 of 39 passes for 216 yards, which is a very inefficient 5.5 yards per throw, but still getting a touchdown and nearly coming back in a game where he lost 21-16. But going back to that season in which he signed that record-breaking contract, he would, in the second game, suffer a horrific injury against the New York Jets. It at first seemed like he had a concussion, but when trainers got a look at him and realized that there was something seriously wrong with his symptoms, they sent him to the hospital, where it was revealed he had a broken blood vessel leading to a hemothorax. And so the story of Brady would begin off of such a horrible tragedy to Bledsoe. However, he would still get one send-off with the Pats as he came in to defeat the Steelers in the divisional round in that season. See, what did I say? The second the Patriots have Tom Brady, even though he's not on the field, the Steelers still can't beat them. And as crazy as it may seem now, the benching of Bledsoe for Brady at the time was very controversial among the Patriots fan base. Remember, Bledsoe was the face of the Patriots and one of the most beloved players in the history at that time. He broke franchise records and he broke their playoff drought. He was a beloved figure. But in retrospect, you can say that worked out pretty well for the Pats. In 2002, they would send him to the Bills, and despite playing some of his best season with Buffalo, he never made the playoffs during his time there, and they would eventually lease him in 2004 for J.P. Lossman. Not a good move. Bledsoe was definitely better than Lossman. He joined back with his former coach Bill Parcells down south in Dallas, and he would have another Pro Bowl caliber season, but was benched for Tony Romo in 2006. Being forced to choose between backup duty or retirement, he chose retirement, where he retired top 10 in passing attempts, completions, and passing yards. He would get into the Patriots Hall of Fame in 2011. And when he settled into retirement, he chose a career where he couldn't possibly be upstaged by any young quarterback: winemaking. Apparently, Bledsoe really liked wine, which honestly is kind of cool. He would team up with wine celebrity Chris Figgins and double back would be born from that partnership. By all accounts, and you'll have to take this from other people's sources as I haven't drank any of Doubleback's wine. I'm not much of a wine drinker personally. They make some really good wine though, and is some of the best in the region. Figgins would sell his share to Josh McDaniels. No, not that Josh McDaniels, as Bledsoe hopefully knows about the dangers of inviting a snake to the garden. On top of Doubleback, he also has Bledsoe Family Winery now, and involves himself with various charities in the area, in the Washington area that is. Bledsoe is one of the more fascinating what-if stories, as who knows what would have happened if Brady wasn't as good as he was. Would Bledsoe have ever won a Super Bowl, or led a team to a Super Bowl, I should say? Who knows, but it is kind of unfortunate how his career turned out. But I am happy for him that he seems to have found a calling in winemaking, and hopefully he's happy doing that. A guy that most fans weren't happy playing for their team though was Danny Kanell, who faced the Bucs when he was on the Giants and Falcons 3 times in 97, 98, and 2000. Now, Kanell is probably more well known for what he did in college than the NFL. The reason I said that is because of one infamous game at FSU. In 1996, he would be the starter during the famous Choke at Doak, one of the most memorable games in the FSU University of Florida rivalry, which is really saying something as they've had some great games. Down 31-3 entering the fourth, FSU would rally to get the team tied at 31-31, which was an NCAA record for largest fourth quarter comeback. Having all the momentum in the world, Bobby Bowden, for some inexplicable reason, did not go for 2. I guess his balls must have fallen off or something, and the game would end up being a tie, although, really speaking, FSU won. I mean, you come back from 31-3, you won the game, even though the score at the end says 31-31. Kanell, despite this game and other really solid stats in his senior year, he would only go to the Giants in the 4th round and was a career backup for New Jersey. In his rookie season, he would be facing off against Trent Dilfer in the Battle of Mid as he attempted to give the ball to the other team. Dilfer did throw a touchdown, but also had 3 picks in there, so they were both competing in the who could lose this game more challenge. Kanell didn't do much better as he had 2 picks and no touchdowns. Overall, he went 14 of 31 for 117 yards, which is honestly kind of disgusting to look at. He would hang around with the Giants for a few seasons and face the Bucs once again next year. And once again, it was a battle of the mid between those 2 quarterbacks. Instead of losing 20-6, he lost 20-3. Trent Dilfer went 12 of 20, which on the surface seems okay, but it was only for 85 yards. Like, seriously, how do you do that? 85 yards off of 12 completions? Is he checking it down to all-star the whole fucking game? He didn't even throw a touchdown this time. It was terrible. But if you thought that was bad, at least Dilfer managed to complete over 50% of his passes. Danny Kanell went 10 of 27 for 83 yards and 3 picks. I don't even know why I'm getting upset. I wasn't born during this time, but this is just terrible, even for the time period. And fun fact, both the running backs for the teams would lead their team in receiving yards. Allstott led the team with 29 yards, and Charles Way led the Giants with 25. So I guess Dilfer was just checking it down to Allstott the whole damn game. I can hear in my head the urinating tree narration for this game, this greatest game, if you will. Eventually, Kanell would join the Falcons as Chris Candler couldn't be relied upon to stay healthy, and unsurprisingly, in a game against the Bucs in 2000, Candler got hurt and Kanell came in. Yet again, it was another very inefficient day, but surprisingly not terrible considering how his last 2 contests went. He went 26 of 43 for 218 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 picks. And yet again, the QB for the Bucs wasn't very good. Sean King went 11 of 25 for a $110, but 3 of those completions were for a touchdown, so I guess whatever gets the job done. Kanell would eventually go to the AFL as the New York Dragons were looking for a quarterback before going to the Broncos and retiring after 2004. He currently has a radio show on SiriusXM, which I guess is just the default career when you can't beat the Bucs as a quarterback on an NFL team. That would not be the case, however, for this next guy, as we have Moses Moreno, who played the Bucs once in 1998 when he was on the Chicago Bears. Now, he had a very solid, if unremarkable, career with CSU, but it was still good enough to get put into the Hall of Fame in 2009. It was good enough to get the Bears to draft him in the 7th round of the 1998 draft. He would start one game in his rookie season. It would be against the Buccaneers. It was not very good. He went 18 of 41 for 153 yards and 1 touchdown, which is, again, disgusting. He would bounce around the NFL for a little bit, including the Los Angeles Chargers, who would occasionally start him because they drafted Ryan Leaf. Although he would file a grievance with the Chargers before they released him, as he claimed that the Chargers knew he was released while he was injured, which is not allowed. It's typical that the Chargers would have a controversy surrounding their quarterback and injury. We all know what happened with Tyrod Taylor, of course. As of right now, he's the current vice president of Able Heating and AC, at least according to LinkedIn. I guess because the universe is feeling bad for me, we have another guy who doesn't have a ton of information on him, which means I am this much closer to getting to the end of this. Eric Kresser played the Bucs when he was on the Bengals one time in the same year that Moreno faced the Bucs. He would play for the Gators before the Bengals took him out of the draft. He would spend 3 years with the Bengals, but only ever attempted 21 passes, and 17 of those passes came against the Bucs in the 1998 game where the Bengals lost 35-0. Kresser completed 7 of those pass attempts for 102 yards, which is a better yards per attempt than Cannell ever had, and 2 interceptions. The Bengals just kind of let him go to the CFL, where he joined the Montreal Alouettes, is that how you say that? After his playing career ended, he would join Benjamin as OC in 2014, before he was promoted to head coach in 2017 and leaving just a few months ago. Well, all good things must come to an end, and now I have to talk about a guy who had a more prolific playing career than Moreno and Kresser. Brian Griese played the Bucs one time in 1999 when he was on the Denver Broncos. He would walk on at Michigan despite fielding scholarship offers from Purdue and Kentucky, and probably the greatest achievement, at least the achievement that Michigan fans care about most, is that he was undefeated against rival Ohio State. He did actually have a good record against other schools and was drafted by the Broncos in the 3rd despite not playing a lot until his senior year. He would back up John Elway until Elway retired, and Griese became the starter in 1999. He had a playing career that lasted until 2008, but somehow only faced the Bucs once during that time. In that game, he went 14 of 29 for 132 yards, 1 pick to 1 touchdown. He signed shortly with the Dolphins after that, but he didn't last long, and he would be picked up by, of course, the Buccaneers in 2004. Griese surprisingly wasn't that bad, as he won 5 of his 6 starts, but his ACL was torn, and because of that, he would be cut by the team. And also, I guess because of that, the Bears would sign him to a 5-year deal in 2006, which seems kind of insane, but the Bears will bear down and throw everything at the wall in an attempt to find a guy who can throw for 4,000 yards, which obviously did not happen. Lovie Smith would turn to Griese when Grossman was struggling or injured, as was often the case, and the Bucs would come along again and decide it would be a fantastic move to trade a 6th-round pick for Brian Griese. I guess they wanted another go-around with him. He would lead them to 2 wins in 3 starts with the Bucs before he retired after the team released him. After his NFL playing career ended, he would join the booth for Monday Night Football from 2020 to 2022, but left that to become the QB coach for the 49ers. He remained as QB coach until last offseason, as he decided he wanted to spend more time with his family, and he also founded the charity Judy's House, which is a child grief counseling organization. And finally, we are nearly at the end of this video. We have one final Bears QB. In 1999 and 2000, the Bucs would face Cade McNown, who played for the Chicago Bears and was 0-3 against the Bucs. McNown would have a successful career at UCLA like Brian Griese, and also like the former quarterback, he was undefeated against the college rival, although in this case it would be against USC. And he will forever and always have the record for most offensive yards in the Pac-10, since there won't be any more quarterbacks in the Pac-10, or any players or schools in the Pac-10. And one notable thing he did in college, besides, studying the most offensive yards in Pac-10 history, was be arrested for having a fake disabled parking pass. So I guess that just kind of shows the character that we're dealing with here. He would become the highest quarterback drafted by the Bears since Jim McMahon, as he was the 12th overall pick in 1999. Although that being said, the 1999 draft wasn't great for quarterbacks. It had guys like Tim Couch and Achilles Smith. If you remember, Achilles Smith is the guy the Bengals wanted so much they ignored the Saints' offer of every single pick in that draft so that they could draft, again, Achilles Smith. That did not work out very well. And even though the draft did have Dante Culpepper and Donovan McNabb, like I said, it was pretty barren in terms of good quarterbacks. Now, McNown would play the Bucs twice in his rookie year, the first game being a 6-3 barn burner, as he and Jim Miller would both take snaps at QB in that game. McNown would go 9 of 23 for 82 yards and 1 interception, and while he would improve upon that in the next game to end the season, it wouldn't exactly be that much better. He did set the then record for a Bears rookie in pass attempts at 42 before Caleb Williams would break that in 2024, but that was really the only good thing that happened. He once again went without a touchdown, but he also once again threw a pick in those 42 attempts. And in those 42 attempts, he completed 20 of them for 196 yards. Despite setting several rookie records for the Bears, although you do have to account for the fact that it is the Chicago Bears, so those records are probably less impressive than they would be on other teams, it did not lead to many wins, and next season would be more of the same story. He would start 1-6 before being benched for Jim Miller. One of those losses would of course be against the Buccaneers. The Bucs under Sean King, throwing 10 of 21, won 41-0. McNown would have a better completion percentage than King, but still failed to throw a touchdown and added 2 more picks to the collection, meaning that in all 3 games against the Bucs, he was 0 touchdowns to 4 picks. However, his demise in Chicago wouldn't solely be placed on his lackluster playing skill. He was a cocky bastard. You can do that, of course, in the NFL if you are a good player. You cannot do that if you are 3-12 as a starter. Some of the things he said, even if he was a good player, would never be excused by most players, though. He made jokes at his running back's expense after he got corrected by the OC in practice. He bragged about his signing bonus to veterans and telling fans who booed him to just stay home. Oh, and then he said the reason he was overthrowing some of his passes was because his receivers were tired. I do think in that case he was correct though, as I'm sure the receivers were tired of his bullshit. And going back to that signing bonus thing, the Bears GM flat out said that rookies need to be taught how to behave around veterans, which, is that not his job, or at least the head coach's job? But whatever, the locker room was about ready to form a mob and lynch him, so the Bears shipped him out for table scraps to the Dolphins. And just like that, another QB prospect was successfully defeated by the endgame boss of developing QBs in Chicago, although you could argue that the Jets are an equally tough boss. We can have that debate later. After that, I assume him bragging about his signing bonus was foreshadowing the fact that he would take roles for various financial groups, where I assume he is now, assuming he isn't bitching about his wide receivers being tired. And there you have it. Every 90s QB that couldn't beat the Buccaneers, although of course some of these games would end up taking place in the 2000s. man, this video was long. It was a lot longer than I thought it would be. I do hope you enjoy it, as this took a lot of effort. As you can probably tell, my voice is dying, even though I had to record this in multiple attempts. So, like I said, I hope you enjoy it and that you like this video, and I will be working on a 2000s video of all the quarterbacks that haven't been the Buccaneers. But until then, see ya.